When it comes to the Alamo, there's actually the historical event. There are some people that like books and artifacts that are associated with the real battle. But then there's the pop culture interpretation of the Alamo that's equally fascinating for some people.
The Alamo has become a very recognizable, widely known icon for Texas and Texas history. In point of fact, this isn't recent. There's an article back in the 1880s in which this journalist pointed out the number of stores, buildings, businesses in the San Antonio area that were named Alamo, and that's still the case.
When you drive through San Antonio, or really the Southwest, it's surprising how many buildings, if you really look at them, you'll say, that looks like the Alamo. And especially in San Antonio, there are businesses that will incorporate the Alamo into its logo.
You open the phone book and there's pages of Alamo businesses.
The Alamo is probably one of the most famous buildings in the world, one of the most easily recognizable facades anywhere. And yet people depict it in the most bizarre ways. And even in the movies, it changes drastically from movie to movie. You can always tell what it is, but it never looks right. Almost never. In the pictures and the toys we have and postcards and everything, it just changes wildly. I'm never quite sure why that is, because it seems so symmetrical and so easy to reproduce, and yet people just go all over the place with it. I've got toys that don't look anything at all like the Alamo, and yet they are, and you know what they are. It's very inspiring to artists for some reason, and they never want to do it exactly the way it looks. They always want to make it different and make the hump bigger or make the building more vast. That's actually changing of recent times, I think, because people get more and more obsessed with doing things accurately and authentically. And while I applaud that on one sense, in another sense, I kind of regret that we lose this kind of berserk variations that we do on these things. We have always known a great deal of truth about the Alamo. There's a lot still clouded in myth, and there's a lot that we just haven't discovered yet. But the movies completely ignore almost all of that and just have their own reality.
The movie is just that. It's a piece of artwork, and art and history are two different things.
Everyone has their own truth about the Alamo and what did or did not happen. I don't know two historians that are in complete agreement on any point of the Alamo.
Almost every film that's been made about the Alamo, certainly the ones I know about, have all maintained that they were going to be the most accurate film yet. And the funniest example of this is John Wayne's The Alamo back in 1960. It's widely regarded as the biggest of the Alamo movies, the most expensive, up until this one is being produced now. Anyway, Wayne's publicity people put out this enormous amount of verbiage about how accurate the film was. And when you see the film, you discover that the Alamo is right beside the Rio Grande River instead of the San Antonio River. And it's impossible to imagine how they could have gotten that wrong. That kind of accidental error making has characterized a lot of the Alamo movies. So historians get upset if it's not accurate.
Historians may look at it and try to understand it historically and do a very good job. But what people know in the street, what people see when they hear the story in the classroom many times, What they see in feature films is not history. And so the story most people know is a mythologized version that they get from popular culture. And so my concern is we need to get that message changed.
What a movie can do very well is serve as an introduction to a historical event.
Well, I think what's wonderful about it is it brings more attention to the Alamo and keeps the whole story alive.
It was very common for me when I was a kid to get a Classics Illustrated comic or the movie tie-in comic or whatever, and read those and think, okay, now this has given me the real background and the movie has given me something else. No movie about the Alamo will ever tell you much about the Alamo itself, especially the movies from the silent era up through the Wayne film, because they're always about something else. What they're about is what that particular era wants to invest in the Alamo. The very first movie ever made about the Battle of the Alamo was called The Immortal Alamo. It was made near San Antonio in the spring of 1911. It was made by a company called the Star Film Company, who came down from New York to spend the winter in San Antonio because most filming in those days was done outdoors. And they stayed at a very lavish resort called Hot Wells Hotel and leased about 30 acres of land across the river, called that the Star Film Ranch. And the year they were there, they made about 75 films, and one of them was about the Battle of the Alamo. That was one reel, so that would be about 15 minutes, and it managed to make the Dickinsons the major characters. It contrived to let Lieutenant Dickinson survive the battle. He actually goes for help, gets Sam Houston to come bring reinforcements. They arrive too late to save the Alamo, but there's Santana and his army at San Jacinto, and an evil Mexican is conspiring to marry Mrs. Dickinson. And as he's about to do so, in they come like the cavalry and beat Santana. So not exactly ripped from the pages of history. For the longest time, there were several stills that we were led to believe were from the Immortal Alamo, which were actually not. And it turns out that they were from a film made in San Antonio in 1914 called Siege and Fall of the Alamo. Siege and Fall of the Alamo is also lost. There is a synopsis of it in the Library of Congress which tells us in general what the film was like, but other than these 4 or 5 stills, we really don't know much about it. This picture of Ray Myers as Davy Crockett has been misidentified as Francis Ford, who was in the Immortal Alamo, but Francis Ford actually played the evil Mexican, Navarre, who tries to marry Mrs. Dickinson. The surviving stills show a very nice backdrop of the Alamo Church. It looks to be painted on canvas or something, but we do know that they shot at the real Alamo, at least something. The Alamo's Shrine of Texas Liberty is a really interesting, albeit god-awful film. It was made in summer of 1938 in San Antonio by a director named Stuart Payton, a British director who had been in Hollywood for a long time, and it was also completely cast with local San Antonio people and prominent San Antonio people. And for a lot of the extras, they went to the unemployment office and hired people to come out and be in it. And so you'll see the battle being fought by guys in like short sleeve white shirts because the movie company didn't provide costumes. It was shot on location at Mission San Jose, which had recently been restored. And so it gives us a kind of pristine look at that mission, which was then out in the middle of nowhere. It's now built, very much built up around it. The Alamo Shrine of Texas Liberty is one of the very few Alamo films that shows survivors of the battle being executed after the fight is over.
A volley of musketry dispatches the Texans. Every rebel Texan able to fight is now dead.
Which has always been a very controversial issue, but you see it in Martyrs in 1915. And you see it in this, and then you don't see it again for a long, long time.
Well, thanks, friend. If you don't insist on having them to yourself, I'll give you a hand. Pleasure, friend.
John Wayne's interest in the Alamo just stemmed back around 1939 when Republic Pictures, the studio he was working for, was going to do a film, Man of Conquest, The Life of Sam Houston. Wayne was hoping to get the role of Houston at the time, but the studio balked, thinking he was perhaps not a big enough star. Wayne still continued his interest and hoped one day when he became a bigger star that he was going to do his own version of the Alamo and doing a guest starring part of Sam Houston. However, all the major studios said, no way, if you want to do it, you want to direct it, you got to star in it too. So he selected the role of Davy Crockett. And finally, after a false start in the 1950s at Republic Studios, he finally got enough backing from United Artists and raised enough capital and all to start on his own. And they began filming in the fall of 1959.
The Alamo, filling the giant theater screen with spectacular adventure, filmed on a scale unequaled in motion picture history.
Afterwards, in the fall of 1960, the film was released in a roadshow engagement. Of course, the initial box office receipts in a limited roadshow engagement were not enough, and some of the reviews weren't as great as Wayne was hoping it to be. So he cut about 26 minutes out of the film and sort of panicked and decided to sell out his interest to United Artists. And of course, a few months later, the film ended up garnering 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. Giving Wayne new life, it actually won one for Best Sound, but also United Artists released it to the general theater-going public, where it suddenly started making money, and it's been a moneymaker for United Artists ever since. This is one of John Wayne's outfits from the Alamo. According to what I understand, there were 6 costume changes of every particular outfit that he would wear in his films, naturally 3 for himself and 3 for his stuntmen. The shirt was originally developed for the movie Hondo several years before, and the moccasins were from Allegheny Uprising in 1939. The particular rifle you see here is a reproduction. The armor on the film, George Ross, perhaps at the time, felt that having Wayne with an original Kentucky rifle, and they actually rented about 22 of them from Stembridge Gun Rentals, would be destroyed. So he came up with a reproduction that was made by Hacker Martin around 1940. What you see right here is a World War II K-bar knife that's sort of been wrapped in leather. It's actually a Bowie-style knife, although made a century later.
John Wayne's film is very much a Cold War film, and the Davy Crockett film that Disney made is very much about the 50s.
It was the post-World War II generation. I think it was before Vietnam, so America was still optimistic. And if you look back at those Walt Disney movies, and especially Fess Parker, I mean, he seemed to personify an optimism, an America when it was new and growing. And, you know, we wanted to recapture that and tap into that.
People always are worried about the treatment. How will the story be portrayed? Or is it going to be the traditional story, or is it going to be a factual account, or something in between?
In general, Hollywood has done a terrible job of portraying the Alamo. In my book, I look at a number of films, but I basically speak about 2. John Wayne, of course, but the one that is more disturbing for me is a 1915 film, older surviving film. It's entitled Martyrs of the Alamo, or The Birth of Texas. That subtitle is very important because it is produced and directed by a protege of D.W. Griffith, who did Birth of a Nation. Griffith is actually listed as a supervisor for the film. If anyone knows the story of Birth of a Nation, of that film, this is Birth of a Nation, but through the Battle of the Alamo and against Mexicans. And so the same kind of racialization that goes on in Birth of a Nation towards African Americans goes on in this narrative, in this film, about Mexicans.
The racial attitudes of Martyrs of the Alamo are very much part of that time. It didn't happen right away. This was never seen as a racial fight for a long time. It was always seen as a political and social division, not a racial one. But around the turn of the 20th century, it started becoming racial. And that film very much depicts that.
Historically, this war was not about race. It was about politics. What sort of a political system was Texas going to have? Was it going to submit to the centralist government of the Mexican dictator Antonio Lopez de Santana, or was it going to adhere to the Federalist Constitution of 1824?
I think the worst you could say is that the political aspects of what the Mexicans wanted to do have been just ignored in the films. So while they aren't vilified, they are patronized to a certain extent. If you look at Davy Crockett, The Alamo, the Walt Disney film with Fess Parker, there's no context at all for what this fight is about. It's just a bunch of Americans in a fort surrounded by an army, and they need help, and they're fighting for freedom. That's all we know.
All occupants of the mission will leave at once. If this order is not followed with dispatch, there will be no quarter given.
I think contemporary Alamo movies are trying to do a better job of understanding the figures who were there. That is, they're trying to look at them as historical figures and not mythic figures, and realize that they were human beings and had their own contradictions as well. I think that actually began with John Wayne's film.
I hate to say anything good about that long-winded jackanapes, but he does know the short way to start a war.
The Alamo movies, except for Martyrs of the Alamo, almost never play the race card. Indeed, the Wayne film goes out of its way not to be racist in that respect. Wayne's love interest in the film is a Hispanic woman. One of the main villains of the film is a white man who sides with whoever will pay him the most. And so he makes it very clear that he doesn't want to draw those kind of lines. And he has his men standing on the wall saying, you know, I was proud of them. These are great soldiers and these are wonderful, brave men. So I would say he bent over backwards to make sure that the Mexicans weren't vilified in the film.
The Alamo is one of those stories that seems to be timeless, that you can look at it and you can say you have very clear villains, very clear heroes, and so it's the type of story that translates well onto the screen. The difficulty is that it's so complicated, it's sometimes difficult to get a meaningful interpretation of the actual historic event.
Of course, the Trinity are the people who are emphasized, but there's an amazing, diverse cast of characters at the Alamo. I mean, you had people from almost every state in the Union and a lot of countries from Europe. You had the native-born Texas Mexicans, or the Tejanos, who were represented in the garrison. Juan Seguin certainly has a larger role to play in the John Lee Hancock film than he's ever been given before. So we tried to acknowledge, you know, the diversity of people in that garrison, and it really makes it a more, I think, a more of an interesting story once you get away from the Trinity.
And I haven't told you this. Nearly all our powder and shots used up. One more attack will finish it. When it's gone, they'll come swarming in here, murdering and killing and... Well, you I'm thinking about.
Normally, the movies give the impression that there was only one Anglo woman, Mrs. Dickinson, there at the Alamo, but in fact there were about 14 women and children, non-combatants, who survived the battle.
And so the interpretation of the women of the Republic years in Texas has not been paid too much attention. And these women, if they could read or write, did not have pen and paper to record their memories. So there's very, very few of them. Most of them are oral, traditional accounts. They're always subject to retelling, and so it's a very interesting aspect.
I think one of the interesting things about the movies is how the different characters evolve from film to film. There are the big three, the Holy Trinity, Crockett, Travis, Bowie, Santana, and also Mrs. Dickinson is the other major character, sort of the Madonna and child of the Alamo religion. For instance, Mrs. Dickinson in Martyrs of the Alamo is a very put-upon woman. She's, this Mexican officer makes advances to her, and her husband has to go out and kill him for that. And the film clearly thinks that he's in the right for doing this. And she's pretty much just a shell-shocked victim throughout that film. In 1937's Heroes of the Alamo, that Susanna Dickinson is much more of a depression, plucky woman. When she first arrives in the Alamo, and she sneaks into the Alamo to come visit her husband, and she goes right up to Travis. She says,
Colonel Travis?
Yes, ma'am?
I'm a Texas woman. I couldn't sit at home. I'll nurse the men. I'll do anything, but I won't leave.
Well, it certainly beats me. A woman always does get her way, Dickinson. You'll find that out.
So she's very much a can-do 30s woman who is strong enough to do what needs to be done.
And darling, whatever happens to us, Texas will go on. A Texas so great, so wonderful in the years to come that you and I can't even imagine. But without us, without the Alamo, that Texas could never be.
Later on, of course, the feminism inherent in that character becomes even more overt. In the TV movie, The Alamo 13 Days to Glory, that Susanna Dickinson comes out at the end of the battle and faces Santana, and she says, I asked that my daughter and the others be spared, but as for me, I would have fought with the men. Very similarly, Santana has gone all over the place. In Martyrs of the Alamo, there's a title card that says that he's a drug fiend, noted for his infamous orgies. And he does spend most of the film being just stoned. He's more a typical villain in some of the films.
When the whale sounds, charge. And remember, no quarter.
Man of conquest. He does everything but actually twirl his mustache. In The Last Command, Santana is old friends with Jim Bowie, and is a very reasonable man who is a businessman who knows what has to be done and knows that he would like to save his friend if he could, but business is business, he's got to go. He doesn't even exist in the Wayne film except as a sort of figurehead at the end. He comes in and watches Mrs. Dickinson leave, and that's it for him. Same thing in the Walt Disney film, not even a character. But then you get to films like 13 Days to Glory, the TV movie, and as played by Raul Julia, he's a very complicated character, and he shows Santana's cruelty, but also his great leadership qualities. That's the most complex portrayal we've had of Santana up until the current film, in which he's played by Emilia Escoveria. The Holy Trinity changes less from movie to movie than other characters do. Travis particularly is almost always a kind of an effete figure, a little bit superior to the men.
Now, tell everybody they're coming! Get up, men!
There are exceptions in the Disney film. Travis is a very modest man. At one point he doesn't want to take over command when Bowie's sick. He says, after all, I'm just a lawyer. But in almost all the other films, he's a little bit better than the men, and his journey is usually to come to terms with the fact that they are all equal and that he's one of them and not their superior. Bowie is an interesting character, almost always a very bad-tempered guy.
You must be Jim Bowie. Well, excuse me.
He was well known in legend to be a drunkard. There are people who debate that on either side, but the movies almost always go for that. Interestingly, in Martyrs of the Alamo, Bowie kind of plays the Travis role in that he is a rich man who is very fastidious. He takes out his handkerchief and wipes off the seat before he sits down, and of course he's taken down a peg when he gets so sick. But he's the slave owner, as he is also in the John Wayne film, as he is also in Man from the Alamo, the 1953 film. We're not altogether sure that Bowie had a slave in the Alamo, but in the movies he almost always does. We do know that Travis had a slave in the Alamo. In the movies he virtually never does. In Alamo 13 Days to Glory, there is an African-American Joe with him, but they're more like pals than master and slave. And they're even talking about Joe's moving on to California and how Travis is going to miss him. In the new film, Patrick Wilson's Travis actually has a slave who he treats like a slave. So that'll be an Alamo Movies first. Now, Crockett is the one who changes the most and the least. Because he was the great frontiersman and because he was an ex-congressman, that's always given people a great dichotomy to work with. And a couple of the movies pretty much ignore the Congress part.
The numbskull voters in Tennessee wouldn't send me back to Congress for another term. And I figured your little war here was the next best thing to Congress.
Heroes of the Alamo, he's just a very folksy guy.
Companies count. Watch old Betsy say hello.
Even Last Command, in which they talk about his life in Congress, he doesn't act like he's ever been in Congress. He still talks like a backwoodsman, and he wears the fur hat and the buckskins and all that. The films that are more canny about this exploit that dualism. John Wayne's is a great example of that because he's very much the politician when he needs to be and the frontiersman when he needs to be. And he even admits that to Travis at one point. I have to be what the public demands me to be. There's a wonderful moment in the 1926 film with Davy Crockett of The Fall of the Alamo when he learns that he has lost the election to Congress. And we meet Crockett. He's wearing a top hat, frock coat, a cravat. So he looks like a congressman. And he learns that he's lost the election and he's crushed, but then he says, it's all good because I have to go to Texas anyway. So, but he goes into his room and he looks at himself in the mirror and he starts taking off these clothes and putting on the buckskin. And especially for 1926, that strikes me as being an extremely sophisticated understanding of who this guy was and what the different sides of him were all about. Any Alamo film that's got any brains in its head knows that that's the most interesting thing, that who Crockett was really and who he wanted to be and who people wanted him to be.
There continues to be a rancorous debate surrounding the death of David Crockett. The traditional view holds that Crockett died surrounded by his enemies in the thick of the fight. More recent information that we have suggests that Crockett was part of a group, 6 or 7, the numbers vary from account to account, but a small group of Texans are thought to have survived the battle. They are spared by a very humane Mexican officer, General Castrillon. He brings these men before Santa Anna.
And it's Santa Anna who orders their execution.
The Mexican accounts say that the honorable Mexican soldiers balked at following such barbaric orders, but members of Santa Anna's staff who had not themselves participated in the battle fell upon these helpless men with their swords and hacked them to pieces.
Most of the accounts, instead of saying that these men begged for their lives, say they accepted it very manfully and were then brutally executed. Some accounts say shot, some accounts say hacked to death with swords, but you don't get Crockett as a sniveling coward in any of them. What is interesting about the Crockett execution is that in the United States, just weeks after the battle, you begin to have an account circulated about Crockett being executed. And it wasn't told to make Crockett look bad or cowardly, but it was told to make Santa Anna look very brutal. And so for a public relations move, it was one way to take the person that everybody knew at the Alamo, David Crockett, and to present his story as something that they could really identify with, that he had been brutally murdered.
And there's also other accounts, such as Mrs. Dickinson was saying she stepped out and passed by his peculiar cap. Enrique Esparza, the 8-year-old survivor of the Alamo at the time, kind of suggests that Crockett went down fighting.
There's never any eyewitness account of the Alamo that is completely trustworthy. Mrs. Dickinson was interviewed a few times. Joe, Travis's slave, was interviewed. Enrique Esparza, who was a little boy at the time and saw his father killed, was interviewed much later in life. But almost all of those interviews only exist in paraphrased form as given to us by the people who interviewed them. And so we never know if we're getting exactly what they said, or if the people who were unaware of what the Alamo was like in 1836 and simply saw it as the church in the Long Barracks fragment were trying to fit what they were saying to that reality. And so there's a lot that we just don't know.
A lot of people talk about the De La Pena account, and the interesting thing with the De La Pena account, there's 2 parts to the account. One's the rewritten diary, and one's the final draft. The rewritten diary doesn't mention the Alamo episode at all, but it's all in De La Pena's handwriting, and there's only 1 watermark and all the same size sheets of paper. The rewritten diary is in at least 4 different handwritings, none of them De La Pena's. It has all different size sheets of paper and at least about 22 different watermarks, as if the paper had cobbled together from one source after another. The controversial Crockett page, which says that he was brought before Santa Anna after the battle, is a different size sheet than the one before or afterwards. And rather interestingly or suspiciously, it turned up in 1955 in the hands of a Mexican coin dealer, Sanchez Garza, after the Davy Crockett craze was going across the United States. If the final draft is authentic, the question is that De La Pena, since it's not in his rewritten diary, did he know about it at the time, or did he get it afterwards?
There should be no controversy. It's well known by historians. Even the David Crockett descendants, always up until 1955, from the 1800s on, always accepted the fact that he was overwhelmed. He didn't surrender like a coward. He was fighting. But flintlocks take 20 to 30 seconds to load and refire, and you had a swarming army coming at you. He was overwhelmed and captured, and if he was executed, that's what they believed. The controversy really came by, shall we say, modern historians and popular culture historians who maybe had a difficulty accepting their hero as they saw it from television when they were young, doing anything but going down swinging. The details of exactly what moment and how he died is not nearly as important as his commitment, like the rest of the garrison, to stand and fight to the end and to sacrifice themselves. That's the key thing, the staying in commitment. You didn't have to cross the line in the dirt, whether it was drawn or not, and we don't believe it was. But the commitment to sacrifice yourself for a better cause, that's the spirit that people admire, and that's what makes the Alamo a very special place.
He chose to be there with the rest of those men, fighting for a cause he believed in. And I think that ought to qualify him for hero status in just about anybody's book. It certainly does mine.
When we talk to visitors who come to the Alamo, often what they'll say is, I felt like I've had to come here, or I've been here before, and I always come when I'm in San Antonio because I saw the Fess Parker Disney manifestation of the Alamo, and it's always been a fascination with me, and so I'm drawn to the Alamo. It and the John Wayne movie had a gigantic impact on the American public that's still being felt today.
The first of the programs in the Disney series, it was on the show called Disneyland, aired in December of 1954. Now, Disney made these 3 episodes just as the first in what he thought was going to be a series of films about American folk legends.
For whatever reason, Davy Crockett, as played by Fess Parker, caught the imagination of that generation. And that wasn't just the generation of kids either. The Ballad of Davy Crockett, the song that was written to accompany the movie, was a runaway bestseller. I mean, millions of copies of that record were sold. The Davy Crockett craze of the mid-50s was a marketing phenomena that was just unprecedented in American culture.
Actually, Disney was amazed too, because as the craze started to develop, he had already killed off the character at the Alamo. So I don't think he was even prepared for the craze. The one thing that he had the foresight enough to do is to film the episodes in color so he could release it in the theater so the kids could go from their black and white TV sets to see Davy later on in glorious Technicolor.
This was a time when all the little kids were wearing coonskin caps and playing Davy Crockett. My very dearest friend from childhood, Celia Tanner, and I played the Alamo as children. She always liked Bowie, and I was always Travis. So my father actually built us a little Alamo in the backyard, and we, continued to play that battle.
And like so many of my generation, I was absolutely besotted with Fess Parker. Had the coonskin cap, had the little buckskins, had the little canteen, had the little rifle, and would play Davy Crockett with my friends. But my fondest memory is when my dad would put me to bed at night, where other kids heard Hansel and Gretel and the Three Billy Goats Gruff. Dad would make up stories about Davy Crockett, just nonsense tales, and they always ended, instead of the traditional "and then they lived happily ever after," Dad's stories always ended, "and then Davy rode off to the Alamo." And I don't think there was ever a time that I didn't understand the significance of that, because I grew up in Texas, and the Alamo is just in the air down here.
I had my Davy Crockett play sets. I had my Davy Crockett bubblegum cards. And one of the things I always liked about him too was Kenneth Tobey as Jim Bowie flashing the Bowie knife. So any particular scene that showed Crockett and Bowie together, it had my undivided interest.
By spring of that year, it was everywhere.
As the craze swept the country, They went from the TV show, released it as a feature film, which this poster represents. As you can see right here, this is an original Kentucky rifle. It was made in the 1820s, and it was used by Fess Parker as his old Betsy in the particular film. And as you can see, the ramrod had broken off. It still is reflected in the poster, and because of that, I'm never going to fix it.
For a while, Davy Crockett was stamped on just about everything you could imagine, and it was a bonanza for Walt Disney.
There were over 3,000 licensed items connected with Crockett.
It was just like all of a sudden that Davy Crockett craze took off. The toys, the marketing was unbelievable, and those things are very collectible today.
Everything from toys to clothing.
The real man's tie.
Over 10% of all children's clothing in that year was Crockett connected.
Anything that had buckskin on or fringe on it or a coonskin cattail immediately caught the attention of everybody out there.
This is actually a real coonskin cap. Believe it or not, it was in the Neiman's catalog back in the, I think in the early 70s.
Comic books, collectors of Alamo salt and pepper shakers, Alamo spoons, things that aren't necessarily associated with the battle, but they're associated with the image of the Alamo itself.
Davy Crockett socks to bathrobes to soap.
The mugs, the medallions, the buttons.
'50s Davy Crockett Bank.
Lunch pails, notebooks.
I actually put the money in Davy's back. Comes out the bottom.
Cups and saucers, silver.
A Davy Crockett chocolate mold or butter mold.
Stuffed dolls. Drinking mugs. Whiskey bottles. And just plain bust sculptures.
Sheets.
Davy Crockett sheets.
Bedspreads, curtains, towels.
Davy Crockett fabric.
Dr. Hardin and his wife gave me these wonderful pillows. Someone had given her this wonderful vintage fabric, and she actually made these two pillows for me.
Anything you could imagine.
Alamo measuring tape. Rather old, but it does come out. Just an unbelievable amount of things.
Even most, I think, unbelievable, Davy Crockett ladies' underwear.
One of the things from the Crockett craze in the 50s that I have that I'm really proud of is the Crockett lamp. It's very unusual to find one with the original shade, so I was excited when I did find that. One of my newest Alamo items is a gift from Frank Thompson's wife, who is an artist. She sent me several little Alamo candle holders, so I'm really thrilled with those. Probably of all the things that I have and I've collected, my most prized are the books that friends have written. I'm very, very proud of those.
The heat of the craze burned very bright and very fast and went out almost immediately. It was by mid-1955, it was in essence over with. But for those few months, it was like nothing the world had ever seen. It was, it's the big bang of the baby boom. It's the time when that generation suddenly came into focus as a force.
We had the Fess Parker, Alamo, we had John Wayne, and it was hard not to be involved. it was also a time where the nation was really aware of its history. And so for children, it was just a natural attraction that for many of us led to lifelong careers.
I saw it on television, and probably every young person from the San Antonio Living History Association grew up watching on TV, went out and bought Davy Crockett books and read about it, and caps and all of that. And but there's a time to move up from that mythology and that legend to tell, you know, the told story, and that's kind of where we've evolved to today.
Who will come with me into San Antonio? Who will come with Ben Milam into San Antonio? At that point, the Texians will storm in through that gate in two groups. One group will fall to the right, one group falls to the left. They don't exactly know how to do that yet. We'll have to figure that out.
Each year, people gather from across the country in San Antonio, Texas, to commemorate the key events which ultimately led up to Texas' independence from Mexico. Here we witness as the San Antonio Living History Association reenacts the Battle of Behar.
Ladies and gentlemen, the San Antonio Living History Association welcomes you to this year's 168th anniversary of the storming of San Antonio de Behar. In collaboration with the San Antonio Parks and Recreation Department, the city's Office of Coastal Affairs, and hosted by the La Villa Tennis Association, the San Antonio Living History Association hopes to give you a brief insight into the historical events and scenes that first gave control of both the Alamo Fortress and the town of San Antonio de Behar to the Texian Federalist Volunteer Army. The Battle of Behar set the stage for General Santana's campaign with his Army of Operations against Texas, and the famous 1836 Battle of the Alamo only 3 months later.
Fighting with crowbars, hatchets, battering rams, in addition to the flintlock musket, the Texans were able to fight through the walls from house to house until these tactics gave them a commanding position in the two northern corners of the town's main plaza. One of the first key conquests of the storming of Behar was the Bear Mending Road. December 7th, the third day of the fight, Ben Milam crossed Sullivan Street to the Bear Mending House, where he was killed by a whip-up.
And now, with our military contingents approaching, we will witness the December 1835 reading and signing of the following documents. Article 1, that General Coss and his officers retire with their arms and private property into the interior of the Republic under parole of honor, that they will not in any way oppose the reestablishment of the Federal Constitution of 1824. Article 2, that the 100 General Coss shall be permitted to take with his force a 4-pounder cannon and 10 rounds of powder and ball. Article 13, the citizens shall be protected in their persons and property. Article 14, General Burleson shall furnish General Coss with such provisions. General Coss approached the victorious commander to ceremonially present his commanding saber. With all courtesies of the 19th century extended,
adjourned. An agreement to all articles signed on this day.
You have witnessed the reenactment of the signing of the capitulation treaty. General Claus and his troops were honorably paroled to march back across the Rio Grande under condition that they would fight no more against the reestablishment in Texas of the Mexican Federal Constitution of 1824.
We've got people in this organization from all walks of life. The fellow that usually does our Santa Ana is actually a district judge. We've got teachers, we've got lawyers, we've got common people. I drove a truck for 30 years. And everybody is drawn together over the love of history.
History is a lot of fun. I didn't know that when I was in school. But it is a lot of fun when you start learning the real history. You know, the little details of why things happen and mistakes and strategy and logic and thinking and irony and everything else is in there in history. It's just a lot of fun.
I'm a native-born Texan, and I do love the historical aspects of that. I got into it through Mr. Fish here, and we enjoy doing it. We enjoy educating the public, the school kids, and just the love of being able to do this is a lot of fun.
I'm portraying New Orleans Gray, and well, I think my earliest interest in Texas history kind of occurred in 4th grade. You know, it's when Texas students it's mandatory that you take Texas history in 4th grade, and that kind of spawned my interest. And I remember going to a living history reenactment put on by these same people when I was much younger, and it pretty much just sparked my interest from there. And I read everything I could and researched as much as I could, and eventually I just joined this organization. It felt like the natural step to do.
My name is Robert Benavides, and I am the chairman of the board of directors of the San Antonio Living History Association. Began getting involved with the organization actually before it was organized in 1987. 1986, the city of San Antonio in Texas celebrated our sesquicentennial. That's the 150th anniversary of Texas independence. After we had reenactors from across the country join us for the first time in this area, once the ceremonies and the programs were over, most of the locals who participated kind of said, wow, this is great, we need to actually continue this, what can we do? And so as a result, the following year, the San Antonio Living History Association was formed.
I joined San Antonio Living History Association because I love history, especially of Texas. And there's a lot of history here in San Antonio that even the history books or even the San Antonians don't know about. So we're trying to surface it back up so people could be more noticeable of what's really happened here, and it's not just a small cover-up. You know, you kind of skim through the top of it.
Over the years, we've evolved into an educationally oriented group of multicultural and multi-ethnic type of presentations to recognize the balance of the population, to a good cross-section of the city of San Antonio.
Me personally is to dress up on the weekends and get together with friends and educate the public, not just one side. I'll never be one-sided. I'll talk about both sides. We do history talks in my place of employment, and I talk about the Mexican soldiers who were just as brave as the Texan soldiers. They had families on both sides.
Well, just like in the American Civil War, you had families fighting on both sides, the Union and the Confederacy. This was true in Texas because you had Tejanos that were fighting on both sides, the Mexican side, and they had a dictator who was quite oppressive. Some of the policies that he implemented were against Christianity in the way they treated the Indians, and well, it was a dictatorship. And so there were some Mexicanos Tejanos that did not like that sort of government. And they saw with the Eastern influence, European influence coming into Texas, an opportunity to change that politic.
My participation in joining with the San Antonio Living History Association was probably a result of my heritage. I trace back my ancestors to the founders of this city, the Spanish Canary Islanders, who were sent by the King of Spain in 1731.
I came here from New York 3 years ago, upstate New York.
Have been an Alamo enthusiast and Texas enthusiast since I was a little boy. Had an opportunity to come down here with the United States Air Force, with the New York Air National Guard as a matter of fact, and did so 3 years ago. Loved it so much and got involved with San Antonio Living History shortly after I arrived here, and decided to stay once I retired.
What you observed here today on the Battle of Behar, which is one of our five annual representations of battles that occurred of the Texas Revolution within the city limits of San Antonio, culminating in the Battle of the Alamo. The men and the women and even the children representing both sides of that story and the local families. I am so proud of them because in the beginning we were sort of an amalgamation of people who came from different parts of the country to tell, oh, the black powder muzzle loaders, and you had those that were Alamo movie, aficionados, and all these blending of people. Then we had educators that joined us, and suddenly we came to a composite to where we have our educational goals to serve in this community in this state and serve the public. And we've evolved in a way that I'm very, very proud of the sacrifices they make, because it's hours and hours of work and study and to put these on for the public. And that's our only payback, is the joy and the understanding when people say, ah, now I understand, we have them and we've won, and that's our payback.
We talk about living history moments, and this is why we do it, because occasionally you have insights into a historical problem that you would never ever have gotten out of a book. And the only way you can do that is by recreating the circumstances. We were down at the Alamo Village in Brackettville, what we irreverently call the Wainamo, and we reenacted the final assault. It began at 5:30. It was dark. It was cold. And the fact that it was dark and we were cold, and that we, I ran to the north wall and I peered over the wall, and you know what I saw? Nothing, because it was so dark. You could hear the Mexican soldados out there, but you couldn't see them. And I had one of those living history moments. I said, well, duh, Steve, that's why they attacked. And I had always thought that, the Mexican soldiers would be easier to see out there, but of course that's why Santana decided to attack at that time. They were hard to see. And also I was cold. I tried to fire my shotgun, and I'm shaking so badly from the cold that I'm sure I wouldn't have hit anything. So this makes the real battle come alive. There was also one of the fellows there that had his son with him. He was about 6 years old at the time, and of course he was sleeping soundly when the battle began. And when he got up, his dad was gone, and the cannon was going off. And cannon, under normal circumstances, are loud, but a cannon at 5:30 in the morning is really loud. And the kid got scared, and he started to cry. And we're all there, and we could hear this kid crying, and just a chill went up our spine, because we realized, there would have been children crying that morning too. And it's just, you create the human circumstance, and sometimes you can get insights that you would never ever get out of a book, and that's why we do it.
A lot of people ask us, why is this an important battle? What does it matter? And if you look at the chain of events in American history, the Battle of the Alamo is associated with the separation of Texas from Mexico and the eventual annexation of Texas to the United States. With Texas as part of the United States, Mexico and the United States then go to war, and at the end of 1848, the United States stretches all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so, in retrospect, the Battle of the Alamo, the Texas Revolution, the war with Mexico, really does make the United States a continental power, but more than that, it puts it on the path of being a global power.
The Texas Revolution actually began on October the 2nd, 1835, at the Battle of Gonzales. We call it the Battle of Gonzales. It was actually more of a skirmish. But it's nonetheless a significant skirmish, because the war's on. There's no going back. Shots have been fired, men have been killed, and the long anticipated revolution is on. At that point, there is a cry throughout the Texian camp on to Bexar, San Antonio to Bexar, because that is where General Koss and his Centralist Army are located. So the Texian Volunteer Army of the People march on San Antonio and lay siege to San Antonio.
And this is called the Battle of Bexar. And in it you had the Mexican troops, or the Centralist troops, that were in control of San Antonio, and the Texans were on the outside. And in a 5-day battle in early December 1835, the Texans fought their way into the city, and then building to building, they were able to force General Martin Prefecto de Cos to capitulate, or to surrender the town and to evacuate his troops to the Rio Grande. And so in the scope of the Texas Revolution, if you had not had the Battle of Bexar, you would not then have the Battle of the Alamo.
At that point, many of the Texians naively believe the war is over, we've kicked out the enemy, not knowing that even then Santana and the bulk of the Mexican army was marching northward.
And it was a civil war within a civil war, because you had both Tory Tejanos along with loyalist, compatriot Tejanos. So not the entire Tejano population was for independence. And then you had a bunch of fence sitters as well.
Especially a lot of the Tejanos are conflicted because they start fighting for the Federalist Constitution of 1824, and then the Anglos sort of take over the war, and then it becomes a bid for complete independence. And a number of Tejanos at that point said, well, sorry guys, we can't go that far. We're fighting for federalism, and you guys are fighting for independence. And but not with, having said that, there were Tejano delegates who signed the Declaration of Independence too. In Texas, the Alamo constitutes a sort of secular religion. It is something that is important in the Texas identity. The religious, almost religious conviction with which people are invested in the story. And it's a story that lends itself to religious imagery. When you consider that the battle takes place in an abandoned mission, we talk about the Trinity of heroes, as if by some divine design, the final assault comes on Sunday morning. The siege lasted 13 days, and the resonance of that unlucky 13, and of course Judas being the 13th disciple. We talk about the sacrifice of the Alamo, or at the Alamo, and then the redemption of San Jacinto. So we talk about now when you go to the Alamo, it's not a historic site. It's a shrine, a place where the bones of saints are housed. A shrine, a place where you go to worship your ancestors. So there is a lot of religious imagery that is caught up in this story, and that people embrace. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the men of the Alamo, in a state which is largely Protestant, these men are our secular saints, and we regard them as such. And that's I think that's why a lot of people who have so much personal investment in this story get a little bit annoyed at obnoxious historians like myself who come along and say, well, you know what you've always believed, maybe not so much. Maybe there ought to be another way of looking at it.
The men fought the battles. The men were the heroes and gained the glory. But in the end, it's the women that preserve the histories, the battle sites, such as the Alamo. And in 1891, two cousins down in Galveston, Texas, realized that the veterans of the Battle of San Jacinto, where Texas won its independence from Mexico, these old soldiers, these old veterans were dying. We were losing our history. So they decided that someone needed to start work, gathering the history and preserving it. And from this, these old San Jacinto veterans came in, so the story goes, walked in, laid their medals down on the table, and turned their memory and their history over to these ladies. And from this, our organization was born.
There are about 300 years of Alamo history at this site. For the last 100 years, that history has been associated with an organization called the Daughters of the Republic of Texas.
To be a member of the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, you have to have had a direct lineage back to the time of the Republic. So you had to have somebody that was here in Texas before February the 19th, 1846. There are daughters throughout the entire state, and there are daughters that are teaching Texas history, and their daughters that are going to the school and working in small little communities. We have 105 chapters. The Alamo is certainly very, very important because, the idea of taking a stand is what we're all about. And so we want to make sure that we preserve the memory for those men that were here and for all of the families that helped maintain Texas independence.
And the Daughters of the Republic of Texas were granted custodianship of the site in 1905. And they were granted that right as part of their effort to preserve the building that we're standing in right now, the Long Barrack, to save it from businessmen who wanted to tear it down and build a hotel. And so really for the last 100 years, it's been the DRT, or the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, that have cared for the site, preserved its structures, created educational programming.
And we continue that today, preserving history, research. It's remarkable how many discoveries are still being made. Sometimes it's a little hard to keep up with them. You hear so many things that are being discovered in a collection or a library collection.
We have a Daughters of the Republic of Texas library, and we encourage people to send in and to bring us their family histories.
Any author of any worthwhile Texas history, we really try to support and encourage, and school children. We go out and talk to the classes. We present them Texas flags that have flown over the Alamo, which is always a very special thing. It's very meaningful to Texans.
Everything is paid for by the daughters. And so we raise money through the gift shop. About 92% of the money we raise for the Alamo. It takes like over $5 million to run the Alamo annually. And so it's a full-time job. And so it takes a lot of volunteers to get this done. Right now we have the gift shop to help maintain it. But before, there was just very little money. And so it would be daughters that would go and their husbands would mow the grounds at the Alamo. There would be dirt floors and our ladies would be sweeping. And we think that it was like our grandmothers who were involved in the daughters that were doing a lot of this work. And, now there's a staff, but before that, it was just the daughters.
In and of itself, if you take the Alamo by itself as a piece of history, it's probably not as significant. But if you take the Alamo and Texas history and you take it in respect to the entire country, the way we are today, it becomes extremely important. It becomes, in my opinion, almost the cornerstone which holds the development of the Southwest together. If you take the Alamo out of that, perhaps history changes. Number one, does Texas become independent? Number two, is there ever a Mexican War? Does the United States gain New Mexico and California as part of their country, as part of the United States? Does Texas become involved in the American Civil War? Is there an American Civil War? Does the United States expand and become as big as it is today? Does it become a world power that it is today? Can I say that that's all because of the Alamo? No, I can't. But if you take the Alamo away, think about it. The Alamo was a focal point in Texas history. It was a focal point in Texas history, therefore, it must be a focal point in the development of the American Southwest.
It was a battle that lasted no time at all. It had casualties that a Civil War battle would barely even mention. A siege that went on for a couple of weeks that without any loss of life to speak of. The battle lasts about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. This is really a nothing of a fight in so many ways. It's really the meaning that we've attached to it that's given it the importance. And I think that there would not be those of us who are serious about history if we weren't first enveloped somehow in the idea of it. And there are those who become so interested in history that they want to do away with the myths. And I think that's a mistake too, because the myth is what gives it the qualities that make us want to keep going after it.